You buy Bitcoin, you hold it for more than 4 years, Joe. That's my advice to everybody.
Fair to say you simply flooded the system with money.
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally.
I'm very bullish on the long-term viability of Bitcoin.
I was going to say, did that surprise you?
That surprised me how much that's gone up.
Hey, Internet. Welcome to another episode of the Acropolis Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, the founder and CEO at Acropolis. In studio with me today is Scott Ellam. He is the founder and CEO at XCE, Connected Excellence, and the managing director at Spencer Riley. And his company has just IPO'd, and we're going to get into all things Bitcoin treasury companies broadly and digging into XCE and their unique place in the market. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Chase.
So it's probably best to just start a little bit back. You and I have gotten to know each other a bit over the last few months, but let's let listeners kind of catch up to where we're at. What was your first interaction experience with Bitcoin? You know, what can you tell us about the first time you interacted with it? And did you get it right away? Did you say, hey, this makes sense on a corporate balance sheet? Explain to us your early thinking.
I certainly didn't jump to corporate balance sheet the first time I came across Bitcoin. First time I came across Bitcoin was, you hear the word, but really understanding some basic fundamentals was 2016. And I think I'm fortunate that I'm probably focused more on overall theories and dynamics and behaviors than I am on the technical aspects. So for me, the first time I heard about Bitcoin, it was 21 million hard cap fixed supply. And that stood out to me. There was nothing I could compare that to. And my first thoughts immediately on understanding that information were, if this is verifiably true, then the price of this will likely go up. And then the next aspect was that it was unconfiscatable and could be transferred anywhere without any third-party permission. And I may not have grokked it with that kind of clear definition at the time, but it felt instinctively like those two other aspects would be a huge benefit to the fixed supply aspect. And my immediate thoughts were that anybody who wants to move capital around the world will need to buy this asset in order to be able to move the capital around the world. And that might be buying the asset for a 24-hour period to move that capital. It wasn't necessarily thinking that it would always be as a long-term store of value for people, as well as a medium of exchange. And then the other aspects that stood out to me when you're thinking about the hard cap element and unconfiscatability, we're not just moving capital around the world, but just preserving capital long-term. I think I went on the journey from 2016 to 2020 where you're discovering different elements about Bitcoin, doing as much research as you can, but the quality of information is sparse. And it's hard to find that really quality, verifiable information, which is abundant now if you know exactly where to look. So there's a bit of Bitcoiner bias goes on where we believe it's quite easy for people to study it straight away. It's probably not still. 2016 to 2020 was my personal Bitcoin journey. Then it moved into corporate balance sheets and Bitcoin fixed for money, fixed for world.
And I assume that you were already running Spencer Riley in those 2016 years?
Yeah, so Spencer Riley started in 2014. So Spencer Riley is now the flagship operating business for the XCE, Connecting Excellence Group. So tickers XCE, companies Connecting Excellence Group PLC. Spencer Riley being the flagship operating business started in 2014. So that's an international executive recruitment company, or some people might say headhunting business. So it's people driven, and businesses like that in our industry tend not to have forward-looking liabilities, tend not to have large capital outlay. In 2014, it's phone, laptop, internet, are the necessary tools to do the job. Sort of improved over years, and there's a lot of areas where you're binding together and you're building an integrated platform for growth. But ultimately, it still boils down to the people in the business and their network with clients and candidates. So 2014 to 2020, if we say, as I'm understanding Bitcoin, I'm solving the problem for myself as an individual. So you run a private business, you're thinking long term. My mindset was always, okay, I'm building this business now. I'll be working on this 24/7. This is my future. This is my family's future, who I've not met yet and not actually got yet. And I'm trying to find a way of, okay, if the times aren't as good in the future as they are today, how do I preserve the money that I'm making in these early years? Because I was probably in my sort of mid to early 20s when I set the business up. So any money I was withdrawing, you go through the period where you buy a nice car and you don't have a house, and then you realize the car is going down in value year on year. And it was at that stage, probably 2016 to 18, where I started to understand Bitcoin, and it became the option for me for a long-term savings account that was simple, took out any of the complexities, and it took that 4-year journey to do that and come to that conclusion. I don't think anybody gets that straight away. I believe you do probably have to go on a 4-year journey to get Bitcoin personally. And at the same time, I'm running the executive recruitment company and building a platform for growing my operating business, which is uncorrelated to Bitcoin, and at the time didn't have any involvement with Bitcoin. And then we got to 2020, and all of that changed when the obvious economic shock was looming. And we see that first in our industry. Because it's an executive recruitment company, because it's international, because we work across different markets, we're seeing at that time in 2020, interviews being cancelled at the end of 2019 in certain countries and certain jurisdictions. And we're thinking this is seriously going to harm the economy. And when that happened, I was expecting, I'd actually moved the business into Leeds City Centre, which is a hub for talent in our space. And my first thought was, this is a great opportunity for the business, because the other businesses are paying rents, they're tied into contracts, they've got lots of staff, and I can soak up that talent now and scale this business fast because of this economic shock. But what the governments did and what the central banks did was just chose to print money, what felt like infinitely at the time, to allow people to survive, but also to just delay that economic shock. And that was the moment where I just went from Bitcoin's great, but people are not going to get it for a few years. I wish people would understand it, to this is Bitcoin's moment. We're about to move on to a Bitcoin standard. Think fast, make the right decisions, because they're going to matter in 2014, 2015, 2060. So that was the moment for me.
It's really interesting. We hear this a lot at Acropolis, where there are, what you might call OG Bitcoiners who have been holding on their personal balance sheets since the 2012s, 13s, 14s, 15s. But it wasn't until the COVID economic print that they realized, oh, wow, this needs to be on my company's balance sheet. I wonder, maybe looking back on it, why did you think, hey, this is appropriate as my personal, store of value instrument, treasury reserve? But it wasn't until that economic shock was looming that you started to think about it for the corporate balance sheet. What do you think was the reason it made sense personally, but didn't instantly click for your business as well?
I think because I'd not seen anybody else do it before. And from a personal point of view, I'm a CEO and a founder. So I have a responsibility to the staff in the business, and I have a responsibility that if the business needs to be here. In my eyes at that time even, I'm thinking I want this business to last forever. So if I'm drawing down for myself in the 2014 to 2020 years, and there's some cash left over for savings, I need to know that I can access that cash should the business come into a situation where there is an economic shock and I need to inject cash back into the business. So for me personally, I'm thinking what I don't want to do is what a lot of private business owners do, which is build a property portfolio. But should I need access to the cash, I can't get access to the cash. I don't want to spend my time going on deep dives into the stock market for businesses that I'm not familiar with, I don't work with, I don't necessarily know exactly what's going on in those businesses. There's a high element of risk to the capital that I'm putting in them. So Bitcoin starts making sense. And then from a business perspective, you need that urgency and you need that need to make a decision. And 2020 and 2021 were the gift that gave people who already understood Bitcoin the urgency and the need to make a decision for their business. So as a private business, I'd already thought, what does everybody else do? They tend to buy commercial property, rent the property back to their own business. How do you access cash? So I didn't want the cumbersome nature of property on the balance sheet of the business. And Bitcoin just made perfect sense. But it was the moment where I saw Michael Saylor buy it as a public company, announce I bought it at a public company, where it didn't take more than a few seconds to think, right, okay, why didn't I think of that? How do I do it with my private business? Here's how. And I'm already familiar with the asset. Here's how, right, okay, I can add an extra wallet to my multi-sig and I can manage it effectively and manage it with a good enough level of governance for a private business. And I can coach my management accountants, I can coach the third parties who are involved in business to understand why I'm doing it, what I'm doing, and how it's being accounted for, measured over the years. So it was a pretty immediate decision for me that this is the best long-term store of value that allows the most flexibility and allows the highest level of security for our business, for our staff, and for the future. So that was the trigger.
Yeah, I'm sure it was helpful to be able to point to Saylor and at the time MicroStrategy, now Strategy, making that move in the public markets. Obviously, there have been a lot of private companies that have been accumulating Bitcoin in the background in a less public way for years, even front running Saylor. I actually started using a Bitcoin treasury for one of my businesses back in 2018. But even for me, it took 2 or 3 years before I realized the same thing I'm doing for my personal savings should be relayed to the business. And at Acropolis, we often deal with the orange pill dictator is kind of the term we throw around. I've been an orange pill dictator. You at your private company were an orange pill dictator. But that's not to say that you can just push a decision that is this seemingly risky or out of left field to various stakeholders in the company that haven't put in the 4 years to learn about Bitcoin. So Spencer Riley began treating Bitcoin as its store of value asset in the treasury back in 2021 with the benefit of seeing Saylor and Strategy. But still, what was it like getting buy-in from early employees, management, partners, investors? What was that like?
It was easier in retrospect. So in 2021, the only people who needed to know were the management accountants and then my executive assistant. The rest of the staff were not necessarily Bitcoiners, and they trust me to make the right decision on behalf of the company. So the company's balance sheet, they're just focused on their role, placing their clients, placing their candidates. The businesses, each individual is in a situation where they're on, in our industry in general, it tends to be modest basic salary, high earnings, based on performance only. So they're geared to generate revenue and generate profit for the business, and their earnings move dependent on the amount of profit they make for the business. So for them, it's not really a consideration of what's the business doing with its treasury or with its balance sheet, as long as we're able to meet obligations and we know we have a healthy, resilient company. So the orange pilling of the staff, if you like, whether they are personally buying Bitcoin or not, we don't necessarily need to ask each individual. They're certainly far more engaged in Bitcoin in the business now than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago. But I drip-fed education into them when I was given the opportunity, and the opportunity might have looked like, some of us are earning really high bonuses. We're looking to invest our money. Can you help? Well, no, I can't. I can't give any financial advice. But if you want to drop me an email and you would like to understand more about money and more about store of values, then I'm happy to do a session. And everybody turns up, and obviously they get the start of human history to today. They get monetary history, they get Keynesian, Austrian, they get 1944, 1971. And they get right through to, okay, let's have a look at asset class performances, and then a DCAing strategy. So just some basic tools to understand how to enter a position with a DCA and how to look at something as a long-term store of value. And then comparing, I remember what I did in that first session was just compare the S&P gold and Bitcoin price performance on a daily or weekly buy from the peak in 2021. And I remember doing that presentation, and Bitcoin was a significant sum down on what the peak was in 2021, but was still the highest performing asset if you'd have executed a DCA strategy. So it was about just giving them the information to meet them where they were in the journey, and then letting them know about the business's strategy. And the business strategy was here's what would have happened had we done this since 2021. Who would have liked to have done that? Everybody would. Okay, well, good news is I've been doing it. And then it was we're moving towards a public strategy. And the public strategy is exciting for everybody in the company. We've had clients reach out, and CEOs of businesses that you just really wouldn't expect reach out to kind of admit, if you like, that they're a Bitcoiner. But the public strategy really allows us to disrupt the executive recruitment industry and sets a platform where we can attract more high billing talent, generate more revenue and profit to buy more Bitcoin. And we've built a team that we can execute an aggressive, disciplined, high governance Bitcoin treasury strategy alongside it. So both elements compound the growth for the other element of the business, if you like. The human capital attraction generates more revenue. The digital capital markets, and a capital attraction element of a business generates more strength to the balance sheet and gives a business more opportunity in the future to be more creative with that balance sheet. So everybody's excited about it, and it's been a fast-paced journey for the whole team. But you're right, from an orange pill, I think you use orange pill dictator point of view, it's been fortunate for me that I've been able to make those decisions and move fast with those decisions. And if I hadn't have had that ability, then I wouldn't be able to go to. We've come onto the public markets last week with a 4-year history of buying Bitcoin through a bear market, and with a strong average purchase price of £1,500, I think it was, which can state and help me build the team that we have, where you've got a verifiable proof of work that this CEO and this founder has been doing this through a period that not many people would have continued to do it unless they had the conviction you need to continue executing it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of private companies look at the strategies or now an XCE and they say, wow, if only I was a public company, then I'd have such a great advantage. I could tap capital markets, I could issue digital credit, I could issue equity to raise capital to buy more Bitcoin and be more aggressive with the strategy. But they often forget that a public company that hasn't yet had a track record of acquiring Bitcoin has to build an incredible amount of consensus amongst the board, the investor base, shareholders, team members, and that their advantage as a private company is the fact that they can move more unilaterally. Oftentimes we're dealing with a founder CEO where it's that orange pill dictator. And so it's interesting, you're saying that for your business, yes, you had the complete authority to move into Bitcoin, start acquiring Bitcoin. You didn't really need anybody else's buy-in, but you went ahead and tried to make yourself available to your team to educate them on why you're making this seemingly out of left field decision. It's really interesting. There's a spectrum with these companies where they think either I don't need anybody's buy-in and I'm doing this unilaterally and everybody just needs to get on board, to maybe in the middle ground, it's okay, I want to get my key investors, key vendor, management team, CPA on board with this and get them fully orange pilled before we pull the trigger. To no, I want every single person in the org to be on board with this and have bought in and feel like they understand Bitcoin and why we're doing this. The advantage is, somewhere maybe more in the middle, where you want management to have your back as you move in this ambitious new direction, but you also can't wait for a team of 50 to 100 to 1,000 people to take the time to learn about Bitcoin in their busy lives. So you really can't wait for the entire team to be bought in before making the decision. And that's really the advantage of the orange pill dictator in this moment in time, where it's still seen as something that is kind of out there on the risk curve. And so Spencer Riley is, or maybe you should clarify, is Spencer Riley XCE, or these are two separate entities with XCE as the public entity? Explain the structure there and why that makes sense.
Yeah. Ticker XCE, XCE Connecting Excellence is the top co. So that's where we are running the Bitcoin strategy through that business. Spencer Riley is the flagship operating business, so a subsidiary of XCE. And Spencer Riley is the cash flowing, profitable operating business. Now, Spencer Riley's got clients such as PwC, Deloitte. It works with the big four around the world. It works in Europe, Middle East, USA. We do 70% of the revenue of Spencer Riley through international clients. And from a sector point of view, we work across logistics, construction, engineering. We work across life sciences. We work in new tech and business advisory. So if you can imagine, Spencer Riley's had a brand for over a decade with some of the well-known businesses within their specific niche sectors. And it has consultants who've built their reputation in that business within those business sectors that are non-Bitcoin native. So we're quite happy to continue with that brand, continue with that operating business there, and put XCE Connecting Excellence as a top co above it. So XCE owns the operating business 100%. We're very conscious in doing that because we wanted to make sure that value alignment with shareholders, staff, clients, candidates is all heading in the exact same direction. So what we didn't want to do was allow the operating business to own the Bitcoin treasury business. It needed to be Bitcoin treasury, top co. That is, top co that's got the Bitcoin treasury has the opportunity to also do the executive recruitment, and we've built a Bitcoin focused division with the operating business that's been going for over a decade owned by the top co. So that's the structure going forward.
And I understand one of the services that you want to lean into is actually helping match Bitcoin talent to either Bitcoin native companies or companies that are starting to embark on their Bitcoin journey. I'm curious, is that something you're already seeing demand for, or you're just anticipating the demand?
No, we are seeing demand, and I'm expecting that by the end of this week, we are probably going to be posting some very interesting opportunities from within the Bitcoin space. And we are it would make more sense if I talk through the Bitcoin division that we're building after giving a bit of an overview of the core operating business and how that works, which I've touched on this. But if you take, for example, if you have a consultant who's focusing on an industry, and I'll just pick an industry unrelated to Bitcoin for this. If you've got a consultant who's working within logistics, they're focused on that market. So they build their own clients, their own candidates. They take the process from start to finish. And if they place a vice president of sales with the likes of a UPS or somebody like that, or a managing director with a small logistics firm, whether that's in America, whether that's in Europe, we'll charge between 15,000 and 100,000 British pounds, so probably 120,000, $130,000 for the placement of the candidate and the completion of that search. And we'll have some payment up front, the rest upon completion. So what we are is sector agnostic, in that if we're now offering performance-based share option incentives as a result of being public and having a Bitcoin treasury to attract talent from our competitors to join the business and generate more revenue and profit. Now, if I move that across to where the Bitcoin aspect is, if we're attracting somebody into the business and they do investment banking, we can just plug them into a scalable operating business and they can start working in that market. So it's sector agnostic and resilient against market downturns. And it's regionally agnostic in that if the UK wasn't the greatest economic environment, we could do more revenue overseas, which has happened with our 70% overseas revenue. So starting a new division is something we're very capable of doing and something we've done a number of occasions. Each division we've got started with one person managing it, the team supporting them that work on the operations, and building a network. Now, I've got a pretty good network within Bitcoin, and the person who's heading up that division has already placed heads of digital assets with tech firms in their market, and they are Bitcoiner. So they're now attending conferences alongside me at times, and they've got clients who I'm unaware of, and they've got candidates who I necessarily haven't met before. So starting that division, the focus of the Bitcoin Executive Recruitment Division is to find high-skilled talent on behalf of Bitcoin businesses. And that talent might already be working in the Bitcoin space, but also it might be in the traditional space and have a passion for Bitcoin. And then when you flip it the other way around and you look at candidates, we work with high-level candidates who want to confidentially move positions. So if someone's in a chief investment officer role in a traditional investment bank or whatever it might be, take any role, vice president of sales, chief marketing officer of a challenger bank would be a good example. If they've got a passion for Bitcoin, that tends to be a serious passion. And if a business that they're working for dismisses the idea of injecting Bitcoin into the corporate strategy, then they're probably going to want to leave that business. So we're there as a confidential conversation where you can say, look, I'd like to find my role in Bitcoin. I'm in a great position at the moment. I'm not in a rush to move, but when the right role comes around, here's what I do. Here's my experience. Here's my expectations. Here's what I would like to look at. And we know that person is going to be right for a role at some point in the future because the corporate Bitcoin adoption is growing and growing and growing. I would say at an exponential rate, but that would be just my feeling from that. So we're advertising right now for a chief investment officer for a Bitcoin only investment fund. And we're advertising for a vice president of client relationships for a Bitcoin investment fund. We're having conversations with Bitcoin-focused venture capital funds. We're having conversations with some incredibly interesting businesses in the space who are looking to build boards and build executive teams that are at very early stages. So when I mention that business is sector agnostic, regional agnostic, someone's coming to us with a business that's at the early stages and they're looking to build a small executive team, we love doing that. If a business is a large Bitcoin investment fund, we're geared to do that as well. And it doesn't matter where they're based. So we're seeing some really good roles coming through, and we just want to position the business to be that one that's got the verified history of a Bitcoin strategy, verified history of Bitcoin placements, and ultimately we believe Bitcoin will continue to eat the world, if you like, and we can position ourselves to be at the forefront of that corporate adoption story as an executive recruitment firm, becoming the bridge between traditional markets and moving into Bitcoin.
Yeah, I'm absolutely a believer that the Bitcoin talent recruitment, industry is getting set to boom here. We've done quite a bit of that ourselves at Acropolis, but not as kind of an official business line, but more just, helping match companies and talent in the space behind the scenes. And we definitely see this as a growing opportunity. I think it deserves a dedicated company with a recruitment background focused on it. So I'm glad to see you all are doing that. And Scott, you obviously wouldn't be very good at what you do if you can't recruit yourself. So the two notable names on the team are Adam Back and Richard Byworth. I'm curious, was it the profitable operating business and proven track record of accumulation that helped attract these names to lend themselves to the team, or were these relationships already in place? What can you tell us about those two in particular?
Richard talked about this just the other day on a Spaces and told the story, so I'll try and repeat the story similar to how Richard said it, but I would say it was the first time I'd messaged Richard was on LinkedIn, and we had a brief conversation over Teams. But ultimately, when I set out on this journey, I did not know Adam Back. I did not know Richard Byworth. I did not know VJ Selvin. But I had a good network within Bitcoin. And I have a pretty deep understanding of who each person is in Bitcoin, what their expertise are. So I made a at the start of any search, we'll make a long target list and we'll prioritize that target list. And from a Bitcoin strategy point of view, Richard Byworth's obviously British, lives in Switzerland, has, I think, 20 years. Let me say, I'm estimating 20 years there at Nomura, running their convertible bonds, derivatives, futures trading desk, and I believe one of the largest desks in the world there, or largest operations at a managing director level. He's launched a Bitcoin-denominated hedge fund in Switzerland that I believe holds 5,000 Bitcoin, and he has deep capital markets experience. So he went into my number one first call person. And obviously Adam Back was high on that list as well, but I didn't expect Adam to necessarily be able to take a role. But as a key strategic investor, Adam's on the team. So I flew out to meet Richard in Zurich for the first time, and we spent the whole day together. We went for lunch, and effectively it was the first time in my career since probably 2012 that I've been interviewed, if you like. So Richard went quite deep into the background of how I'd started in business, as far as sort of my upbringing, ethos, values, how I started the business, what the story was before the business started, how the businesses grew, how I managed the business, and a detailed look into the current status of the business and performance of the business, the team. And I believe Richard was probably impressed with my sort of tenacity, persistence, and the fact that I'd told him I would be flying out to meet him a couple of days after I made contact, regardless of what his diary looked like. And I came home from that meeting, and I know Richard took some references from within the industry from some very well thought of people who know me, and he committed to joining the business, and he's a board advisor for the company, and he's worked incredibly. He's given us some incredible time to the process, and the insights that he can pack for the team into sort of putting together the year's experience he's got in capital markets and really strengthening the point, the direction, and the execution has been extremely valuable. And then Adam Back, Richard spoke to Adam Back and made the introduction from me to Adam. And I think both of them at the start of the process really understood my vision, which was this. And Adam said at the end of our call, without me having to prompt him on this, but this, I firmly believe, could be one of the first traditional businesses to grow as a direct result of the Bitcoin treasury strategy. So we've had the strategy already. We want to move into a public business with an aggressive Bitcoin strategy. What that allows the operating business to do at very little cash cost, if at all any cash cost, is then say, okay, well, if you're a £5,000 high-performing individual biller in another company like ours, or even a £1 million biller, which means one person at their desk generating that kind of revenue for the business, then if you'd like to join our business, we can now give you long-term share incentives based on your personal performance. So however much revenue you generate for the business, you'll get some share options based on the revenue that you've generated. And it's performance linked and self-sovereign. So it really fits that Bitcoin ethos, that network effects. The business is synergized with Bitcoin where it needs to be. And I think Richard and Adam really understood that. And that's why they joined the mission, if you like, for XCE. And then, as you said, we are an executive headhunting firm. So I was probably under some pressure before we hit the public markets to build a strong team. Richard Byworth has also got a good network, and he introduced me to Vijay Selvam, and me and Vijay spoke. And Vijay is an ex-head of governance at Goldman Sachs for Southeast Asia. He's in chief counsel roles on NASDAQ listed digital asset exchanges. He is Harvard lawyer, Oxford solicitor. He's one of the sharpest minds in Bitcoin, in my opinion, and he's had the experience where he's on calls with Ben Bernanke back in 2008. He's been a gold bug. He's coming to Bitcoin. He's authored an incredible book called Principles of Bitcoin. He's value aligned with us on the team, and VJ's obviously on board and worked incredibly hard. And then in the UK, Sam Roberts, who is over at Cartwright Pension Trust, and Sam has worked on and led one of the British Bitcoin pension fund allocations. So he's took a non-executive chairman role, and then we have a CFO who's a city-facing CFO who's focused on, or previously been focused on, main market listing. So we believe we've built a team that's right for now, but also right to take the business into the future as well. And we're an executive recruitment firm, so we'd always be open to hearing from good people who are not just interested in finding their petition in Bitcoin, but believe they can add value into the future. I think it's always important to meet good people. It's not as important to try and time that right. So my LinkedIn is always open.
Yeah. I mean, you know this, not just because you've been operating a business for a long time, but you're in the business of attracting talent. You're really only as good as your team. And it's actually interesting. So Sam Roberts there at Cartwright, he has parallels with our chief investment officer, Glenn Cameron, who led the effort at Cartwright to get the UK pension fund, the first UK pension scheme to allocate to spot Bitcoin. That was the last thing he did before joining Acropolis as our chief investment officer. So we've got a little bit of a bloodline shared there.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure these gentlemen and their impressive resumes and backgrounds in capital markets were incredibly useful to you as a founder entrepreneur going through your first IPO process. So I've heard from many incredible operators that the growing pains are very real when you go from private to public. Obviously, you're at the beginning of your dynasty in public markets, but just the preparation process. What can you tell us about that? Were the investment bankers that you were speaking to familiar with these Bitcoin strategies? Were they excited by them or turned off by them? What can you kind of tell us about the length and the difficulty and your own personal growing pains during that pre-IPO process?
Yeah. I enjoyed, we started the process in May. I've enjoyed the whole process. It's been incredibly intense, and there's been a lot of elements of it that are, you're exposed to things that you haven't had the opportunity to be exposed to before. You're managing a much larger team of third parties when it comes to the lawyers, the advisors, the company secretaries, the investment banks, but you've built a great team around you who've got that experience. So the process is extremely detailed, which allows you to ensure that you're building robust processes and governance for the future, and allowed us to have the foresight of what will we need to ensure we get right now to allow the business the best opportunity in 2026. And that process is something that you've got to have the level of conviction you need to be a Bitcoiner to go from the start to the end of that process to prepare a private business for an IPO. It's probably more complex with our business than it would be with most, because we do 70% of our revenue overseas and we work across a number of different markets. So there's a lot of coaching for the auditors on the way in which you might structure what currencies you're charging in and this side of it, and then also explaining to a third party new set of eyes and fresh eyes that the Bitcoin wallet and the number of transactions is, we had a set daily buy for quite a long period. So it was coaching them to understand that and to be able to verify it through third-party sources as well. And by third-party sources, what I mean is mempool. So you are teaching people, but because they're engaged in the process and because you've engaged them as your partners in the process, they're obligated to start studying Bitcoin and by osmosis, start understanding Bitcoin. So from the conversations at the start of the process to the end, I believe you can see people going on the Bitcoin journey and speaking to the traditional investment banks, extremely excited about this opportunity and excited about the business. And I get calls where they might come up with an idea and they want to run it by me and say, okay, you've mentioned this sort of these plans into the future. What if you structured it in this way? And it's an education process for them, because they're not coming at it from a 2021 MicroStrategy investor hat, talking about MNAV and talking about Bitcoin accretion. So it's been a really good education process. And I suppose the whole ethos of this business is Bitcoin treasury company, operating business growing as direct result, but people driven and network driven and speaking to new people. We have 100,000 connections in the business at a mid, a senior, and executive level across a number of different markets and jurisdictions. We're built to slowly osmosis orange pill all of those clients in the traditional space and be there to give them their chief Bitcoin officers. But throughout the IPO process, when it comes to traditional investors and investment banks and institutions, there's nothing I love more than going into a room of 10 to 20 people who are capital allocators who don't understand Bitcoin and don't understand the Bitcoin treasury space. I've been put into rooms in this process being told you've got half an hour to speak to this room of people. And an hour and 20 minutes later, they've kind of ended the meeting. Some of them have gone, but some of them won't leave. And they're sort of asking me personal questions about Bitcoin, and I'm ending up finishing the meeting by saying, right, well, everybody here who trusts me now after you've had this conversation, if you download Wallet of Satoshi, I will send you some sats now so you can actually feel what it's like to receive it and see a transaction happen before I leave. And you're just seeing growing enthusiasm. And that brings me right back to the start of this conversation where there needs to be a need and there needs to be urgency. And in the capital markets in the UK right now, there's a need, you could say, for people to study and understand Bitcoin, but that urgency is being slightly increased in that we have over, last time I checked this, so £1.2 trillion worth of savings within retail investors trapped in ISAs and SIPs. And I think you may have had James Van Straten on this podcast say that, by the way.
Yeah.
But that trapped money there, only recently in the last couple of weeks, the budget has come out in the UK, which has now made sure that you're not allowed to save the cash in the ISAs or the SIPs. You must allocate it to stocks. So there's now a new incentive to further understand, well, if I'm being forced to allocate to stocks with my savings, I want to pick ones that I want to be in for the long term. And if that person's got an indication that Bitcoin is a good long-term store of value for them, and they also want to understand an operating business that, okay, understand the operating business, I know how it generates revenue, can see how it's going to grow, then there may be opportunities there for people to look at it and say, okay, that's an interesting angle for me. So the investment banks in the UK and the institutions in the UK have been really proactive in understanding it. And like I say, it's enjoyable for me to speak to a room of people who are on the journey.
Yeah. And so far, I've heard you talk a lot about the use of free cash flow, profitability from the underlying operating business at Spencer Riley to acquire more Bitcoin. But we're obviously seeing a lot of new and interesting playbooks emerge in the public Bitcoin treasury space, things from issuing digital credit, tapping the ATM, which I know there's a slight difference in the UK market when, in terms of language and vehicles on that front, as well as things like acquiring other companies that are holding Bitcoin but trading at below 1 MNAV, basically buying discounted Bitcoin and an operating business. Things like Strive are really focused on. So I'm curious, are you all focused on kind of the pure free cash flow DCAing into Bitcoin, or are you looking at these other more exotic strategies?
Right now, the stage we're at the business, we are looking at strategies for the future. So we had the raise for the IPO last week. We went out for a minimum of 1.5 million. We were oversubscribed, several times oversubscribed on the retail raise, and we were significantly oversubscribed on the institutional raise. So we capped the raise to 3.3 million, and then we came onto the retail broker platforms, some of them on Thursday. It was by Thursday afternoon, Friday, some of them not yet today, where it was quite slow in the UK to get them pipes in place. But from a capital markets perspective, we have an accelerated placement agreement in place, which kind of alludes to what you just mentioned there, that there may be different terminology and different structures in place. But what that allows us to do is to accrete at a high MNAV on behalf of shareholders and gain more Bitcoin. We've also drafted, designed, and are considering launching a convertible bonds in the future, and that would be Bitcoin denominated convertible bonds to ensure that there's a low risk to the business with those bonds and a upside and a low risk to the investors in those bonds and benefits to the shareholders with those bonds. So much like every decision that we've made in this process, it's value aligned with the shareholders, it's value aligned with the bondholders, it's value aligned with the team in the business. So we want to be active, we want to be creative, we want to be forward thinking, and we want to be innovative with our capital raising as we go into 2026. I wouldn't have Richard Byworth on the phone this morning and VJ on the phone this morning and be speaking to the likes of Adam back unless we were ready to execute that kind of plan. But there's only, I suppose, so much which you can go into until those things are absolutely signed off, ready to execute and publicly announced.
And obviously you began this process, I think you said back in May. So you could not have anticipated what the current MNAV compression or sentiment in the space would look like now as you're coming public. But we, even if the fundamentals, I think, don't align with this thinking, we are seeing some bearish sentiment out there right now and some compressed MNAVs. And maybe some companies that may struggle to actually rebuild momentum for their accretion strategy. I'm curious if the current sentiment in the market affects you all in the near term, changes how you're thinking about potential strategies. Yeah, what can you share about just this coming public at a moment when it's a little rough out there?
I like challenging markets, and I think the being able to execute, hold conviction in challenging markets is the foundation for performing when you're in a strong market. So yes, the sentiment in this marketplace has changed significantly from May as we went through that process. We're at a healthy MNAV today, and we've got cash coming into the business that obviously our Bitcoin treasury strategy is to allocate a significant amount of that cash to Bitcoin. So we purposely, at the start of the process, and I aligned this with the team, is I believe it's important for our business to start at a small market cap and take investors on the journey, not ask them to meet us at the destination. That's just what fits this business. It fits the operating business, the Bitcoin treasury business, to do that. So we believe by having the small market cap, we can drive strong torque throughout next year, even in a difficult market. But when you look at that market there, if you remember, I don't know if I said the date in which we started our group Bitcoin treasury strategy, but it was October 2021. So I have been there as a CEO and founder of a business where the price draws down 80%, and I've bought every day or every week throughout that period. So I am extremely comfortable with the highs and lows of sentiment in Bitcoin as a leader of the business and someone who's executing the strategy. And I believe that's beneficial for investors and institutional investors, and also our retail investors to hear and understand. And the team is a board of Bitcoin maximalists. You've got Richard Byworth, Adam back, who are obviously share the same kind of conviction as myself, in that we tend to be perma bulls, but you deal with reality, and they have the skill set. I believe I have the skill set, the business has the skill set to be able to perform in a low market sentiment environment. Now that might shift the focus of the buying somewhat, in that we've got the tools to access capital markets. We're seeing really strong demand, several times oversubscribed IPO. But at the end of the day, we've got an operating business that will grow as a direct result of this as well. So to be able to build on the business's value proposition, we want to be driving that business forward as well. And the team in that business are extremely capable, experienced team who are focused on their mission. So that's probably where I'd sum it up, Chase.
Yeah.
We've been there and done that and bought throughout a 4-year bear market. The last few months is not something that's sort of wavered any conviction.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised to hear that the strategy is to start with that small market cap and bring investors along with you on the journey as a way of making sure that you have at least, 3-4 years of forward-looking Bitcoin torque, acceleration, accretion, whatever kind of terms you all are using to define those metrics. Because I've had Richard Byworth on this podcast, and he was adamant about the strategy of starting with a small market cap so that you can really show that track record of Bitcoin growth per share. Another way that we think at Acropolis companies are going to try to differentiate themselves in these markets, but that we haven't seen yet, understandably, there's so many interesting ways to differentiate right now, whether it's Bitcoin M&A versus digital credit versus ATM versus free cash flow generating businesses like what we're seeing with 21 and Jack Mallers. They're really promoting that kind of Bitcoin native operating free cash flow acquisition strategy as their point of differentiation. One thing that we at Acropolis think will ultimately, and maybe we're still years away, maybe it's coming around the corner, but a way that companies will differentiate themselves will actually be in terms of custody. So it wouldn't be Acropolis if I don't ask a custody related question. So how are you all thinking about custody? Because obviously you could buy the Bitcoin ETF and still call yourself a Bitcoin treasury company. You could do third-party custody. You could try to self-custody over time. I'm just curious what the current thoughts around custody are.
The private business, I was using a multi-sig with another institution holding a key, and then geographically distributed keys, multiple safety deposit boxes, retinal scanners, face scanners, and all of what you'd expect. But moving into a public business and putting this process together, we have worked with partners on the due diligence, governance, security, and compliance aspects. And that's deep due diligence. And as we've worked through that, we've had to align it with the UK expectations of public company and UK regulators. And then we've had to align it with and make sure that we've tried to give the highest level of governance and robust procedures that we can as a Bitcoin treasury company, because we have a deep understanding of Bitcoin. And that's not necessarily been the case probably for a number of other companies where you see the new entrants sort of turn a Bitcoin treasury company on all of a sudden in their marketplace. It's hard to get that experience, but the team we've got have got it. So deep due diligence, deep governance, compliance, security, and where we came to was having the option of two providers for custody that have over 100 billion assets under management, that have very well-known global institutions as owners and using them for custody as well in Standard Chartered, with a name that came up there as both owners and using the company. But it's something that we want to continue reviewing, always be looking at the future and future-proofing, and always be speaking to leaders in that space. So I know me and you will keep having conversations, Chase, and from a point of view of just the fundamentals that were non-negotiables for me in that process with those custodians were proof of funds for me to be able to view as a Bitcoiner. Now, it was a little more complex before the IPO to have the discussions about actually showing proof of funds and the timing of announcements and the movements. That's an ongoing conversation that we'll review as we go into the future and try to sort of optimize and work out the best way to set a market standard, maybe in our jurisdiction. Somebody might do that first, in which case, that's fine as well. But it was very important to me personally to be able to see the transactions on chain and see the wallet on chain. And also we've got the quorums of keys between different institutions and robust policies and procedures in place. Yes, but I think the bit that Bitcoiners will understand is you wanting to see the wallet and make sure that you've got a view-only option.
Every business will hold Bitcoin. Some already do. Others are developing a plan. Acropolis is how smart companies take action today. Built on multi-institution custody, Acropolis delivers a turnkey Bitcoin treasury solution designed specifically for businesses. Here's why that matters. Multi-institution custody is the breakthrough that unlocks the corporate adoption of Bitcoin. It eliminates the need for employees to hold cryptographic material and removes reliance on any single custodian. Instead, Bitcoin is secured using a 2 of 3 multi-signature quorum, where each key is held by a separate, regulated institution. No single party can move funds on their own, eliminating single points of failure and greatly reducing risk. We act as an extension of your treasury team, managing institutional-grade custody, insurance, continuity planning, and strategic advisory, so your company can adopt Bitcoin confidently and securely. If your team has been sitting on the sidelines, unsure of how to get started, or worried about getting it wrong, this is your signal. Visit acropolistreasury.com and schedule a consultation. Bitcoin is reshaping corporate finance. don't get left behind.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nobody, whether the individual or an entity, should compromise on being able to go to mempool.space and verify independently that the Bitcoin is sitting in that wallet. Absolutely. Last question for you here, Scott, and then we'll let you get out of here, because you clearly have a busy week ahead, as well as probably a really busy week behind you. Is just we're seeing quite the tailwinds and the setup in macro. We've got in the US starting what you might call QE, or at least a less restrictive interest rate policy beginning. You see China has recently begun their plans and their money printing. A lot of institutional buy-in and adoption and regulatory clarity coming out of the US in terms of Bitcoin on the balance sheet, corporate, bank, institutional involvement in the asset class. Yet we're sitting here hanging out just below 90K, which I think would surprise a lot of people, and maybe makes folks like you who are entering capital markets happy to be able to be scooping up Bitcoin at these prices when you have such a long-term view. But are we entering the bear market year of the traditional 4-year cycle? Are 4-year cycles over now that we have so much institutional adoption? Has the halving become irrelevant as a proportion of total outstanding supply? What are your thoughts as just an individual, not necessarily speaking on behalf of a public company and forward-looking projections, but what do you just think? Are we gearing up for another bull market continuation in 2026? And how can we not be, given all of the macro tailwinds?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin this year, I think, has frustrated people, and it tends to do whatever's most painful for those long-term investors in Bitcoin's emotional state, if you like. And you see quite a lot of emotional thinking, and that's zoomed in Bitcoin compared with other capital and macro markets. And there's not just, you're not looking at it like gold, and you're not looking at it like other commodities, because it really matters to the people who are investing in it, because of the wider effects that Bitcoin has on society at second and third order effects and the incentives it gives. Now, from a Bitcoin bear market or bull market perspective, I am a perma bull. You've got, I think, JP Morgan releasing the convertible bonds based on the IBIT, which means that I think December the 16th, 2026, it's in JP Morgan's interest for the Bitcoin price to be a lot higher than it is today. You've got Larry Fink going on every interview that he gets questioned about Bitcoin, speaking about nation states and sovereign wealth funds buying Bitcoin, and quoting this year saying, I wouldn't be surprised to see it at 500,000, 700,000 a coin. Neither would we, Larry. So you've got Jamie Dimon being forced to eat an orange pill, regardless of how much FUD they would like to put out about MicroStrategy and how much they've maybe subtly tried to attack Mr. Saylor. But I think what you'll see is nervousness from those with low conviction. But you'll see these events happen. You've got the regulatory acceptance and proactivity from the US government. I've just seen today the UK government saying we're effectively planning to follow the US government in 2027. Better late than never. You've got these milestones happening. And when the MCSI exchange, which is a small exchange by comparison, you've got, I think, January the 16th is that decision final. You've got these catalysts that once they're confirmed and once people understand what they mean towards Bitcoin, you will start to see more new conviction come into the space, new allocation come into the space. But it takes a long time for institutions to put the pipes in place to be able to really put capital into the Bitcoin marketplace. Imagine, you've just spoke about how difficult it is sometimes as a private business with a number of stakeholders. You imagine being a world-leading bank and wanting to offer access to Bitcoin for your customers, whether they're institutions or retail. How many lines of compliance and check off and sign off and different policies and procedures need to be put in place for that to happen? That could take years, and I'm sure that they're working on it behind the scenes at a frantic rate to make sure they get to the market. But they're never going to state that until they get there. You'll see the finished product and it'll look like they've done it in a week. But I can imagine there's a lot of activity going on ahead of January 2026. I believe January 2026 will break that cycle mold, which will just unemotionally attach people from the 4-year cycle which welcomes people back into the space who maybe decided to take some chips off the table this year. And I see the price over the long term as up and up. How much do you think everyone would have allocated to Bitcoin, Chase, if they'd have known 4 years ago that there was a extremely strong possibility that each coin would be worth $90,000 today, the day we're speaking? How much allocation do you think they'd have put in 2020? I think you'll see them catalysts coming through in 2026 where it becomes so obvious where it's going that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I think it's true. The 4-year cycle historically has become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are perhaps selling off at this time, assuming that we're entering that bear market period and then forcing that onto the market. But out of all of the positive catalysts and all of the boxes that Bitcoin has checked, just in the last probably 24 months, personally, I think we see new all-time highs in 2026. And if we do, and we actually dispel the 4-year cycle narrative once and for all, that could perhaps be one of the most bullish catalysts going forward. And that's actually what I expect to see. That's my base case. But Scott, thank you so much for joining me today on the Acropolis podcast. If anybody's made it this far in, please give us a like and a subscribe. And Scott, let them know where they can go and follow your work.
Yeah, they can follow me on X at BTC Only Scott, and they can follow XCE Official, which is the XCE Connecting Excellence page on X, and both of us can be found on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Scott. We'll be following along. Talk soon.
Thanks, Chase. Speak soon.
Every business will hold Bitcoin. Some already do. Others are developing a plan. Acropolis is how smart companies take action today. Built on multi-institution custody, Acropolis delivers a turnkey Bitcoin treasury solution designed specifically for businesses. Here's why that matters. Multi-institution custody is the breakthrough that unlocks the corporate adoption of Bitcoin. It eliminates the need for employees to hold cryptographic material and removes reliance on any single custodian. Instead, Bitcoin is secured using a 2 of 3 multi-signature quorum, where each key is held by a separate, regulated institution. No single party can move funds on their own, eliminating single points of failure and greatly reducing risk. We act as an extension of your treasury team, managing institutional-grade custody, insurance, continuity planning, and strategic advisory, so your company can adopt Bitcoin confidently and securely. If your team has been sitting on the sidelines, unsure of how to get started, or worried about getting it wrong, this is your signal. Visit acropolistreasury.com and schedule a consultation. Bitcoin is reshaping corporate finance. Don't get left behind.